I'll go ahead and get started. So good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. And thank you for joining our second Indigenous trustee panel. Today's panel will focus on how to engage and build strategic relationships with Indigenous leaders and organizations. So before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the unceded Algonquin territory, and I'm located here in Ottawa. Because we are meeting both nationally and virtually, I'd like to acknowledge the land of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island. I hope you can all join me in acknowledging the land in which you are joining us from today. And if you're unaware, I encourage you to do some research and find out. So my name is Renee St. Germain, and I'm an Anishinaabe and a member of Rama First Nation in Ontario. I'm also the Acting Director of Education for the Assembly of First Nations, and I will be moderating the panel today. For those of you who joined us for our first Indigenous trustee panel, We're Ready Now, Let's Talk, Reflections from Indigenous Trustees, we hope that you are able to reflect on the conversation and move towards action. As always, I would like to acknowledge the work of the CSBA and their dedicated board of directors and the Indigenous Education Committee for helping to create the space for trustees to listen and learn from these important conversations. So today I have three panelists joining us who have a wealth of knowledge and experience with Indigenous education. First, we have Colleen Macpherson, who's a journalist by training. Colleen chose to be at home when her boys were small and became involved with the education system through opportunities like being a library volunteer at her local public school. Her first encounter with the public school board was as head of the parent committee that successfully lobbied for the creation of a theater space in her son's high school. Colleen was first elected to the board of the Saskatoon Public Schools in 2009. During her years as a trustee, she served four terms as vice chair of the board and chaired both the pension and governance committees. In November of 2019, Colleen was elected chair of the board and was returned to the position in November of last year. She also chairs the public section of the Saskatchewan School Boards Association. If that wasn't enough, Colleen works as a freelance writer and editor and is training a one-year-old golden doodle named Archie to stay off the furniture. Next, we have John Chenoweth, and John is joining us from BC. John is a UBC Native Indian Teachers Education Program graduate. That's quite a title. And a former elementary school teacher and principal and a district principal for First Nations education. His teaching career began in 1994, and he transitioned to the post-secondary level in 2007. He is a member of the Upper Nicola Indian Band in the Nicola Valley. John has been involved in First Nations education at both the K-12 and post-secondary level for his entire career. His research interests include marginalized people within education and Indigenous education. John has been married for 30 years and is the father of 2 sons. So, and last but certainly not least, we have Mary Culbertson. And Mary is Saskatchewan's first woman treaty commissioner and is Nogawe from and Irish, Scottish, English descent and a member of the Gisagus First Nation. She was the first member to earn a Juris Doctor from U of S Law and practice law in Saskatchewan. In January of 2018, she became the Treaty Commissioner of Saskatchewan. Her professional experience spans from federal government departments, provincial government ministries, national and territorial Indigenous organizations, tribal councils, provincial and community-based organizations, as well as volunteerism and advocacy. She is the daughter of a residential school survivor whose family has persevered through intergenerational legacies and trauma. She is the mother of 4 grown children who have made her a proud cookum. So I wanted to welcome all panelists and thank you for taking the time today to meet with us. I know all of our schedules are quite busy, especially as we hit this 1-year mark of a global pandemic and how life has changed. So Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are on the call listening in, I also wanted to thank you for joining on this important conversation. Right now, I see about 73 participants, and I think that's really encouraging to hear that because now we get to have these conversations virtually, more people are able to listen in. So that's really encouraging to see. So today I have a series of questions that I'll be going through with the panelists. However, we have left time at the end for questions from the audience. So I do ask if there's anything that sparks your interest or you have a question along the way, throw that into the chat and I'll help facilitate the questions at the end. So my first question will go out to all panelists and we'll start with Colleen. And the question is, in building relationships with Indigenous community members and leadership, what can strategic partnerships look like? What are the first steps in reaching out? And do you have any specific examples from your region?
Thank you very much, Renee. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I want to start just to give a little bit of background on Saskatoon Public Schools. We're a very old school division. We were established in 1884, which was even before the province of Saskatchewan was established. And we are the largest school division in the province. We have about 26,000 students in Saskatoon Public Schools. We have 61 schools and about 3,000 employees. As I was thinking about this question of strategic partnerships, it seemed to me that they take many forms. Certainly from my experience with Saskatoon Public Schools, they take many forms, both formal and informal. And I'm thinking about some teachers in our core community schools who go out and do home visits to get to know students and to get to know their families and to try and build a relationship between the school and the families. And those to me are strategic partnerships in sort of on an individual basis. And I think those kinds of partnerships are really important. But when we talk about more formal partnerships, we have many examples within Saskatoon Public Schools. We have partnerships with local businesses, for example, that commit to and support individual schools in a variety of ways, from providing food to literacy opportunities and recreational programming. We've got some integrated services models in several of our schools that involve social service agencies working to support students' physical, social, psychological well-being. And those models include nurse practitioners, occupational therapists, mental health counselors, a number of service providers that come into the schools to provide families with the services on a regular basis. Even more formal than that is an agreement, for example, that we have with the Central Urban Métis Federation here in Saskatoon. And the result of that has been a cost-shared Michif teacher to support schools as they develop their cultural competencies around language. We also recently signed a reconciliation and education partnership with the Saskatoon Tribal Council. And the objective of that partnership is to enhance Cree language and culture programming that's been going on in our division for more than 20 years. And we have a very special and long-standing learning alliance with Whitecap Dakota First Nation. It's an alliance that is probably our longest standing strategic partnership within the school division. And it has resulted in some really exciting opportunities and created some really interesting supports for students. And I'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later. But then when I was thinking about how these strategic partnerships start, I always come back to the idea of two people sitting down, maybe over a cup of coffee, and simply addressing the question, how can we work together to better support students? So that might be teachers and in-school administrators talking about how they can reach out to individual families and increase the engagement of families with schools. And it could be a First Nation chief and a director of education or a board chair sitting down and saying, really, what can we do together? So in my experience, it always starts with a personal relationship before it blooms into a more formal strategic partnership. And I think that's critically important to understand, is that all of these initiatives start with people, with individuals who have a common goal, and allow that to just develop. It also takes not only those relationships, but I think it takes a bit of courage. It takes courage to acknowledge the gaps we have in our understanding of each other. We come from very different backgrounds, and to bring that together, it takes courage to ask questions that might shine a light on those gaps in knowledge. And I think it also takes courage of your convictions to be able to work together and understand that really through a combined effort that you really can make a difference for students. Thanks.
Thanks, Colleen. I really like what you said, and I know that's something that we do a lot in our culture, is sit down and have tea or lunch before really getting into business. And I think we really miss that in the virtual sphere of things, because we don't get that personal connection. A lot of the times it is just business. So that's a new thing that we have to navigate. But to me, that really makes sense about the personal connection. So I'm going to go over to Mary, and Mary's also from Saskatchewan. So I'll have her answer the question next, and I'll just read it out loud again. So in building relationships with Indigenous community members and leadership, what can strategic partnerships look like, and what are the first steps in reaching out? Do you have any specific examples from your region?
Thanks, Renee. And thank you, Colleen. And thank you to everyone who's participating and making time and space to be here today. I am from Treaty 4 territory. I reside in, and my office is in Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan. When it comes to building relationships and education and with communities, I will speak from a point of what I have seen and some things that I have participated in. Where, like Colleen had said, it starts with people. And it does, it starts with individual relationships, and there's the professional relationships as well. So those individual relationships, they grow and expand to being professional relationships, whether it's, just having a chat with maybe your child or your grandchild's teacher or a family member's teacher, participating in school committees, going to events. It starts very small in participating with your child's schooling and building relationships on that personal level. And then we see larger relationships and partnerships being built, whether it might be a school board participating with an organization, or a school board or district participating with a tribal council or a First Nation. And sometimes I see that those relationships are mandated. And I know there can be a large debate on whether or not that's a good thing or not, but what I have seen, it creates that space. So it was creating space in some cases where Indigenous positions as trustees are actually, and again, we can have whole discussions about the effectiveness of mandated positions and so forth, but that space is created there. I'll give an example of creating relationships where, say for Saskatoon Public Schools, I know one of the cultural liaison staff from having his daughter participate in our youth and service program. So then I met with her dad, and then, met with her mom, just, casual. I'm glad your child's participating. She's such an asset. She's a great role model. And that relationship built from there, and then we decided to partner on something else. And then we partnered on a languages initiative. So then the OTC was involved there. So we were able to come bring public treaty education pamphlets and a booth to the language initiatives nights. So that was great to participate in, building those small relationships. And again, when school boards or districts have barriers in place, such as I've heard this too, where how do we even reach out? And I come from Saskatchewan, and Colleen comes from Saskatchewan. But as a treaty commissioner, and in my former life, I was a lawyer as well. We can't deny that there's a huge barrier when it comes to racism and discrimination. And we have that barrier there. It exists very well. It's loud and clear here. That in itself is a barrier on how do you even reach out and say hello to somebody. How does that principal or administrator or that school board, who do they even know to reach out to? And having authentic conversations and relationships, and people are very leery sometimes. And then that comes to barriers in relationships, which I think is one of the questions later. But great examples of creating those strategic relationships on a personal level and a professional level is just maybe connecting with parents, connecting with educators. It's just those small things. Like, there is value in breaking bread together. There is value in having a coffee together. And building our broader relationships always starts with people. And this can't be said enough. So it's having people skills, communication skills, understanding too, wanting to understand, being okay with asking uncomfortable questions, but coming from a perspective of, I want to learn, can you help me understand? The FSIN, OTC, and Saskatchewan Indigenous Cultural Center and Sask School Boards Association actually entered into a partnership. And it was in one of the first days that I was in the commission office. And one of those examples of relationship building is that exactly, the FSIN, the OTC, SICC, and Sask School Boards Association. So that's 4 parties involved in a relationship. And of course, you always need the people there to see those along. So sometimes we hit bumps, and especially COVID, things have really slowed down, but it's great to have your partners you can call on. They have been helping us tremendously, Sask School Boards Association, with trying to advocate for having evaluation and measurement of treaty education in the province. And I can speak more about that later on, or with others, or in private questions, but having those relationships and allies helps us tremendously in fulfilling our mandate and being advocates in any way we can that stays within our mandate. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mary. I always think back, one of my last trips that I was on, work trips, was last February, and it was to visit Mary in her office at the Treaty Commissioner's office in Saskatchewan. And it was on treaty education. And I just, Mary's such a wealth of knowledge on treaty. And I was shocked at how much I didn't know. We hear about it growing up, and even being Indigenous myself, there's just so much to explore. And so it really is about finding, these people such as Mary and other treaty commissioners, who really have all this knowledge to share. So I thank you for your comments. So John, I can read the question again. So in building relationships with Indigenous community members and leaders, what are strategic partnerships? What can strategic partnerships look like? What are the first steps in reaching out? And are there any examples from your region over in BC?
Thanks, Renee. First of all, I'd like to just acknowledge everyone for being here today. And as mentioned by Renee, everyone is quite busy. But for myself, as the other 2 speakers have mentioned, relationships are key. And for anyone visiting an Indigenous community, you might run into an elder, and the first thing they're going to say is not "what's your name?" They're going to say, "Who are your people?" And that's a starting point of about how important relationships are, and your identity is, and your family is in your community. And that question about who are your people, it lets everyone know that you belong to something bigger than just yourself, that you're connected to the community, your family, and ultimately the land and the spirit world. And with that in mind, if school systems understand that our Indigenous communities work from a position of a system, a very connected system, you start looking at relationships a little differently. And if you want a kind of a backbone for how to work with Indigenous communities, I think you could look no further than Verna Kirkness and Barnhart's 4 R's. You know, the respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. Those are, I think that article is about 20 years old now, but it's still very relevant for today's world, especially where you have Indigenous communities working with public systems, right? And I'll call it a system. And relationships are key, and with a deeper understanding of what Indigenous communities operate like a system, a very interconnected system. Systems like ours in a public education have a much greater opportunity to build those strong relationships. And just a couple examples that I'd like to share is, let's use one that's a high importance across the country, and that's the revitalization of Indigenous languages. So us as a system, as a school system, even though I'm a member of the community, my first question to the community is not going to be, hey, by the way, we're starting an Indigenous language program. It's going to be, hey, how can we help you revitalize your language? What can we do from this side to support you? Right? There's only one answer a community can give, and that is to really ponder, how can that system support us? Now, to do that, that requires a system like a public education system to sacrifice its control over that Indigenous language. And that's a hard thing for systems like ours to do, but we need to cross that barrier. And once you do that, you realize that the identity that we're trying to create and try and restore within Indigenous communities, the only source of that identity is in the community, right? So you must have the community in your pocket as advocates, as partners, in order to proceed with that. And I know that some school districts in British Columbia have Indigenous language programs, actually quite a few. And it's a constant work provincially as part of a national network as well to keep enhancing that language. And, in the interior Salish where I'm from, all linguistic groups here have Indigenous language programs, but it all starts with, how can we support the community to revitalize its language that we as a system ultimately removed through residential schools, right? And that's the role we need to look at it as a school trustee lens. Another aspect for relationships, and I'll use a superintendent model for this, is we need to not be afraid to go and build those relationships with our communities. And I know just within our area, one of the superintendents locally spends 1 day a week, pre-pandemic, of course, but 1 day a week at each of the communities in the area and works from there. They're given an office space. They can meet with parents. Something very small, but you're in the community and you're meeting people. And ultimately, you start sending other folks out to work in communities, and it becomes a real strong relationship builder, right? And another model is to get your staff into the communities and get your communities into the schools, right? And it all starts with relationships, but it does require us as a system to surrender control to the community that is the only source of identity for Indigenous kids. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Do you mind repeating who wrote the article on the 4 R's?
Oh, Verna Kirkness and Barnhart.
Okay. Verna Kirkness, and we can add that to the chat.
Sure.
For those who are asking.
You just need to Google 4 R's Kirkness and it'll pop up as a PDF.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she has some great stuff out there.
Yeah, there is. There is.
Muted myself.
I know.
So our next question is going back to Colleen. And it's How can schools and school boards maintain relationship accountability with Indigenous students and communities? What are elements or examples of healthy or meaningful relationships?
Thanks, Renee. I think I want to answer the second part of the question first, sort of, and this takes me back to my earlier mention of our Learning Alliance agreement with Whitecap Dakota First Nation. And I guess I mentioned this and provide this information just as an example of how these strategic partnerships need not be stagnant. They always need to grow and develop. So Whitecap Dakota First Nation is located about 26 kilometers outside Saskatoon. And ever since about the 1960s, students, after they had completed their K-6 education on Whitecap Dakota, would come into Saskatoon and attend elementary school and then go on to high school in Saskatoon. But that was a really difficult transition for a lot of students on a lot of different levels. And back in 1993 is when discussions first started, and I know it was a cup of coffee and it was two people, and they started exploring opportunities to provide support. And in February of 2002, Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Saskatoon Public signed our first memorandum of agreement of this Learning Alliance. And it contained a couple of really critical elements. One is that it allowed Whitecap to retain jurisdiction in education and also focused not only on student outcomes, but on strong Dakota cultural components. And so over the years, what has happened is that we have continued to look at this agreement. It's been through several iterations. And as we have both worked towards supporting students that are moving from Whitecap Dakota into Saskatoon, it has evolved. It's an agreement that has evolved. It's governed by a joint governance committee, which is shared responsibility and accountability from both Saskatoon Public and Whitecap Dakota, and a joint operations committee to oversee the agreement. And so where we're at now in terms of this alliance is that in 2017, we opened a brand new school in the south end of town, and that became the designated school for students coming to us from Whitecap Dakota First Nation. And we also, around that time, extended the boundaries of Saskatoon Public Schools to include Whitecap Dakota. And so that school has become an alliance school of Saskatoon Public School. And the advantages there would be things like access to professional development for teachers, access to all of our special programming in Saskatoon Public. And that school is now a pre-K to 4 school. It's called Charles Red Hawk on the First Nation. We named our school in Saskatoon Chief Whitecap School. The federal government contributed some funding to the building of the school in order to create cultural spaces that support students and families in that school. And it has just, I guess my point is that it has evolved, and part of, now the first part of the question is around accountability, and I think accountability is always maintaining relationships, personal relationships, but also being open to new ideas and to new directions. And that has allowed this, this alliance agreement that we have with Whitecap Dakota First Nation to really develop over the years into something that's really meaningful. And when we talk about accountability on the part of the school board, I think for us, it really has been brought to light by our new strategic plan. We adopted a new strategic plan in June of 2019, and it's built on 4 student goals of academic excellence, character, engagement, and well-being. But we committed to fulfilling our goals through relationships, equity, and accountability. And accountability, in this case, is about using evidence-based practices. It also says right in our strategic plan that we will focus on Indigenous student success. And so that is our accountability. We will be held accountable to that. We have also committed to enact anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. and pursue a representative workforce. We have written this into our strategic plan, and we will be held accountable for fulfilling those commitments. So there's many elements involved in accountability, but it does really come back to maintaining the relationships and keeping in mind why we're doing this. And in all of the cases, it's about helping students and improving outcomes for students. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Colleen. Accountability is something that we talk about a lot here at the AFN, and how provincial schools and school boards are accountable back to our First Nation, because what success really means for our First Nation students and communities. So it's a conversation that we're all interested in having, because we're all here to see all of our students succeed. So building off of that and looking more at the historical relationships and treaties, I'm going to ask Mary the next question. And it's, how can schools and school boards respect and honor treaty rights? Why is this important for our schools to teach treaty in the classroom?
Thanks for the question, Renee. Of course, one of those problems that we have in this day and age too is when you get that message, your internet connection is unstable. So I'm glad you posted the question again about historical relationships and treaties, and how can schools and school boards respect and honor treaties and education in the classroom. So in Saskatchewan, again, it's unique in that treaty education in the classroom, teaching treaties in the classroom, was mandatory since 2007 as mandatory curriculum. At that time, the provincial government and the OTC and the regional body FSIN worked jointly to create that curriculum through knowledge keepers, through elders, through curriculum writers, consultants. So it was huge teams, and it was huge investment in order to get that going and start rolling out. And it was Commissioner Arnott who actually started the treaty education and teaching treaties in the classroom. He's now the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission chair. He still believes very strongly in education in the classrooms is a way to combat discrimination. In our area, of course, Saskatchewan, it's an opportunity for teachers to be able to embrace that true history of Canada, right? The history that's been mainly left out of academics and K-12 and curriculum for so many years. In 2007, it became mandated. But when I was a kid in small rural towns in Saskatchewan, we didn't have that opportunity to learn about treaties. We had a very Canadian colonial whitewashed history that was taught to us through social studies and in every aspect. So today we have these opportunities where our classrooms are the foundation for those catalysts of change. It's where we can introduce students to pride in their identity, pride in their culture, in who they are, where we can also protect them by providing that education. A good example that I'll use is where I grew up and went to school and first learned about education and racism and why it was important to be teaching these things in school was because of a non-First Nations, non-Indigenous student who made remarks, and that was in grade 2. I was like 7 years old, but my teacher didn't say, "Don't say that, that's not right," or "No, that's not true," to that other student. She just nodded her head in agreement. And I'm privileged, and I acknowledge that by my very fair skin. So I have always remembered that and how that student could just be okay with saying that. And the teacher was just okay with her saying that too. And nobody else in the classroom even blinked. And then thinking back now, I'm like, that was grade 2. And that was already ingrained that it was okay and that was normal to say those things. And then fast forward 38 years later, from that same school in that same area, we have a young little girl who wore her ribbon skirt to school. I know how much I pay for ribbon skirts if I don't make them myself. That is formal wear, right? Believe me. But here it was up to a non-Indigenous person who worked in the education system to determine that that wasn't formal wear. Where non-Indigenous people should never be the people determining what's racism, what's discrimination, and what's not. So we've seen this, incident very it was in the media a lot. It was very publicized, but she had a lot of support. And support on the outside means a lot when you know people are standing with you and they're standing up for you. And it's an example of how the education system was a huge failure for so many years, where this person who worked as an EA was also just okay, that it's acceptable to tell a little Native girl, no, that's not formal wear, you shouldn't wear that. Would you say that to another child? Maybe from a foreign country, if they wore their traditional regalia to school, would they say that? But it's okay to say it to a First Nations girl. So teaching treaties in the classroom is that opportunity where we can start to build anti-racism, where we can start to, dispel ignorance, where we can have those conversations and about relationships, because it's all about relationships, about how we treat each other, about how we're going to relate with one another. Respect, the 4 R's. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, Dawn, because it totally reminded me about when I read that. And I'm so glad I jotted it down. And like, I gotta send that out to my staff and say, we have to remember these 4 R's. And of course, treaty education is an example. If one area is doing it, others will follow. And again, it's that identity building. It's being proud of who we are, understanding our ancestors built what's now Canada, and what those relationships meant. If we didn't have treating treaties in the classroom mandated in Saskatchewan, I mean, we have a long way to go. We have the problems that we do, but it's there. We have people who support it. We have educators who support it. And of course, we have people who don't. I've been in those places where I was invited to speak at a high school, and had the principal and vice principal standing at the back of the classroom where I was speaking to grade 12 in Law 30, and both had their arms crossed and shaking their heads when I talk about the law and treaties. And that's somewhere I went to high school. And this was just 2 years ago. So we have to be really cognizant and call those things out and acknowledge that they're there. Because if we don't, we're just going to keep using flowery words and thinking the sky is blue all the time and we're moving forward. But we have to address those barriers that come up, like the ugliness of discrimination, like the ugliness of racism. And we have to make sure that moving forward, the sky is not always blue, that there's going to be gray days, and we're going to work on those gray days, and we're going to address them. And we're going to do it courageously. And that's where our relationships come in. Call on our allies, call on those people who we've built relationships with to help us when we need that help. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. It's really good to hear personal experience too, to put it into perspective for everyone. I know it was hard to read the article of the little girl in the ribbon skirt, and it did go viral. And I think the response was really powerful for, the First Nations people and non-Indigenous people across the country that kind of came together in response to that. So thank you for speaking to it. So our third question is for John, and it's on Indigenous voice. So what can schools and organizations do to ensure Indigenous voice and worldviews are not only included, but integrated into the education system? What needs to happen to ensure this process happens respectfully?
a really good question, Renee. I think that the very first place that we as a system need to start from, and before I answer that, I also want to say that I'm a school trustee in British Columbia, first term, and I work with a amazing group of people in our own school district, but even beyond that, an amazing group of people from our zone and around the province that we're all paddling in the same direction, which is really refreshing. Okay, I want to start out with that. But in order for us to ensure that there's voice for our Indigenous communities, I think that we as a school system need to first have a deep understanding and acknowledgement of the socio-historical realities of our Indigenous communities. And that's a dark place to go. We call it sometimes the dark underbelly of Canada, because it's that reality where Indigenous people have come through residential schools and begot the TRC and UNDRIP through United Nations. And the first thing is a deep understanding and acknowledgement of that history of Indigenous people. And if we can do that within our systems, provide that information to our staff, to our parent advisory councils, to our students, you start building bridges across large gaps that Mary talked about around just historical racism, right, within Canada. And it's needed to be done. You need to go into those dark waters in order to come out the other side. And sometimes it's difficult, but eventually you come out tighter and together and in a stronger relationship with that. Now, in order to think about Indigenous voice, it's really about Indigenous identity. And I spoke to that a little earlier, but there's a word in our Okanagan language called kwamkwam, and it's a Proto-Salish word, which means it's in all of the Salishan languages in British Columbia, and it means balance and beauty. And I've had a grandmother tell me that if you want to understand what kwamkwam means, you picture yourself sitting in one room having a cup of tea, and in the next room, your grandchildren are playing and they're laughing, and everything feels right in your belly. That's kwamkwam. And she said that's what school should feel like for children. And that's what school should feel like for parents that send their children to our systems, right? And how do we achieve that? That's a very good question, because we need to ensure that we involve the community, because they are the sole providers of the identity of the children we're working with. So the relationship there is critical. And if we think about that moving forward, the curriculum that we work on with the communities, it has to be legitimized by the system, respected, right? It has to be very, very, very meaningful that the community says, you know what, that system is teaching about who we are. And I feel good about that. I have kwamkwam thinking about that. That's a very important thing. And if we don't have a legitimization of students who bring in their own identities, their own cultural ways or teachings from their own families, then those core values aren't recognized by us, and slowly but surely our relationship erodes with that community, and that's just going to happen. And if we think about how can we partner with Indigenous communities on this process, all of these questions speak to one thing, and that's relationships. And the only thing that we can do there is be having authentic relationships with our communities. And authentic relationships meaning not being afraid to open your arms and say, how can I help you? Like that. Sorry, I stretch across the screen. But how can I help? How can we as a system address your community needs through TRC, through UNDRIP, through residential school legacies, right? What's our role? Because we have a responsibility as a system, just as we do as individuals, to work toward balance, to work toward kwamkwam. And when we think about being integrated into the system, it's got to be done using the 4 R's, language especially. And if you go to the community and say, how can I help you with your language? what kind of response are you going to get back? Unless it's just, I don't want your help. We don't want our language here. And that's fine. That's okay. But if we want to ensure Indigenous voice, we need to start from that premise of understanding the historical, socio-historical reality of Indigenous people. Now, beyond that, policies make for a lot of movement. And in this country, if you think about Indigenous education, and I'll say specifically for British Columbia, I don't think we'd be where we are without strong policies being implemented by the province. And those strong policies don't get implemented without Indigenous communities that have a very strong voice pushing the province continually about the systems not supporting our children. We need change. So policy begets change. And even in British Columbia, with when we think about Indigenous language, you know, the feds are really pushing Indigenous language revitalization. When the feds put in process a policy, it does affect change right down into the individual school boards, right? And that's one thing. Policy can beget that. So what can we as a system in terms of a school board implement for policies that could help address some of those areas within Indigenous education that we want to cross, and ensuring that our communities are doing well and they feel respected. Thank you, Renee.
So John, you've talked a lot about building relationships and authentic relationships. And I noticed a question in the chat that I think you responded to briefly, but I'm hoping you can respond a little bit more broadly to it. So the question was, if we have 600 Indigenous students and about 60 of them are from the nearby First Nations, how do we engage with the rest? And I think this is often a common obstacle and barrier when we're talking about large school districts or municipalities, you know, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, and other places where there might be multiple First Nations surrounding. So how do we ensure that we're or, you know, Inuit or Métis communities, how do we ensure that we're reaching all of our students and building really a strong system for everyone?
You know, that's when I first started my teaching career in BC, targeted funding for Indigenous people was becoming more of a mandated thing within the province. And with that, if you're from BC, I don't know about Saskatchewan if you guys have targeted funding for Indigenous students, but right now it's approximately $1,100 for every Aboriginal student to run Indigenous or Aboriginal programming, right? So when that first came out as policy, right, then school districts started saying, okay, we need to, number one, how many Indigenous students do we have? And it kind of started a real crux around who's Indigenous and who's not. And you've got the Indigenous community saying, we are the Indigenous people from this area, including my own band, and everyone else is Métis, Inuit, or non-status, and we start getting into these constructs that are not of the Indigenous community, right? It's a dividing people, and those constructs are from policy from the federal government around you're on reserve, you're off reserve, you're Aboriginal, you're Métis, you're non-status. All of these constructs are not of the Indigenous community, but they've created kind of a mess within an Indigenous consciousness across the country. And I don't see grandmothers categorizing Indigenous people in any way. So as a system, when we think about Indigenous education, we think globally, right? And, you know, every child in the big cities, you know, I'll give you one example, Vancouver, Surrey, those are some pretty big school districts in our province. There's probably more Cree children attending school there than there are Coast Salish, right? And so what do they do about that? Well, they start offering Cree languages, right? You have to embrace your community and serve your community. And that's what happens. And for districts that have, like I think it was Nick who had, you know, 650 Aboriginal students and 50 are from the Tsawwassen First Nation. The other 600 have ticked a box that said, I'm Aboriginal. And a lot of those young people and their families, they know somewhere that there's Aboriginal ancestry, and they may not know how to explore that or not even really want to share it before, but now they are, right? And so you need to find a way to have those folks not fade back out. Bring them forward and celebrate them and support them, right? And to do that, many school districts have amazing Indigenous programming for all students, and they celebrate all different Indigenous cultures and practices, but they always want to honor the local first because that's the traditional territory upon which you are. So that's all what I would recommend. Honor your land-based Indigenous people and support and honor everyone else who's attending. And as any grandmother or kokum, Mary, would agree to, you're going to move forward in a good way and you're going to have quam in your belly.
Thanks, John. Mary, I see you nodding your head a lot. I was just wondering if you had anything to add or expand on there.
Oh, it's just about systems, right? And systemic discrimination. And when John was talking about the constructs of who's an Indian and who is not an Indian, who's First Nations, on reserve, off reserve, right? It's systemic discrimination. And I remember my cuckoo, actually, because my mom married my dad in 1971. And so, of course, as we know, the Indian Act said if she was not the property of an Indian man, she wasn't an Indian anymore. So she married my dad for love, I guess. And she wasn't an Indian anymore. But yet we grew up there, you know, on Keezakus. I didn't know any difference. I didn't know what the Indian Act was. And then someone one day told my cuckoo while we were at Cuckoos and playing outside, and the whole family's there, and they were talking about Bill C-31. And someone said, well, she's not an Indian. She can't be from here. And pointed to, I think it was my mom, and I was playing there. And my cookum got so upset. And she said, don't you dare come tell me who my grandchildren are and who they aren't. And then the conversation changed real quickly. And she said, we decided who our people are, not anyone else. And that's still true to this day. And that was, you know, in the late 70s, early 1980s, where, you know, I heard my daughter saying the same thing the other day. She was filling in an application to start a program in the fall at SIIP here in Saskatchewan. And she goes, it asks what band I'm from. And I said, well, Keezakus. Yeah, but I don't have a status number. And I was like, because her dad's Métis, and you know, she, under, of course, systems that were created, Bill S3, Bill C3, she can be status under the Indian Act. So it takes years right now to get your status through the system, right? Years for those bills. So that's still very much there today. And I told her, you're from Keezakus, that's your home, that's where your family is, that's where your people are. And she's like, okay. So she filled in Keezakus, you know, but those systems are still very strong, and we have to embrace them and work with them. Like John said, if out of 600 kids, you have 50 from one First Nation, they're not the majority, but you have to embrace that. You still have to include them because their identity is important, as well as the other 600 kids, right? All our identities. Thank you. I'll stop nodding my head now and getting interrupting.
No, thank you, Mary. I think, you know, and that was something that we discussed that we did want to touch on was barriers. And I think we see a lot of systemic racism in education. But I just have a question, maybe Colleen, you could chime in. Are there any other barriers that you see or have experienced when creating these relationships with either Indigenous leaders, organizations, communities, and trying to make that change?
Thanks, Renee. I continue to be on a path of learning here, and one thing that an Indigenous friend of mine, we had a conversation about not too long ago, was how our schools physically look, what our buildings look like, and what that potentially brings up for a lot of Indigenous families. We have some very old schools in Saskatoon, big 3-story red brick buildings, we call them castle schools. And this very kind man pointed out to me that even what our schools look like can create barriers for a lot of people. And that was a new understanding for me, and really changed the way I think about those kinds of things. And I still have a lot to learn, but when you talk about barriers, even a physical building can be a barrier. People don't want to go into those schools. They bring back memories of residential schools. And so it's important that we understand, and that people are kind enough to point out to us, and I'm very, very appreciative for the conversation that we had, that barriers exist where sometimes we don't see them. And that was one I've been thinking a lot about in the last few weeks, is that idea of what a school looks like and what that conjures up for a lot of people.
Thank you. And I think that's something that, a lot of people wouldn't really realize, because it is, I know I'm not from Saskatoon, but I know the type of school you're talking about. And it's very much the type of school I went to, that was built back in the early 1900s. And it has that schoolhouse feel to it. And it can be a deterrence for some people. Just as the way, when we look at education, how it's changing and adapting, and it's going at a slow pace, but we don't all learn the same. So do we all need the same type of building? Is that everyone's safe spot? And that's important in education, to have a safe space.
Yeah.
So another question we have here is, looking more globally too, and thinking about Indigenous worldviews, how can we move beyond just the human connection and really create the space for schools or school boards to maintain a relationship with the environment and land? And even Indigenous languages are really important when we talk about our culture, but really just creating the space for students to explore, and not only Indigenous students, but others, with these connections that are becoming so much more important, I would say in 2021, that we really start embracing it. So are there any tips that you would have for any of the 84 participants on this call on how to embrace an Indigenous worldview that would be outside of that standard school building? And I don't know who wants to answer that question. Colleen?
Just make a comment, just an observation that I've had, and it's particularly come up during the past year when, we have such restrictions, physical restrictions related to the pandemic in our schools. Even in the area of the city where I live, I have never before seen so many classes of students who are out and about. They're finding all these wonderful opportunities to get out of the school building and to experience the land and the environment and explore it and talk about it. And I think it's been one of the upsides, I think, of what's been happening to us is that students are learning that learning doesn't always take place inside a school building. And I think that's really important. And it's for Indigenous students, all students, to learn in the natural world, I think is critically important. And we've seen some really creative things happening around outdoor programming in our system. And I think it's been very valuable for all students.
John, I think you were going to jump
Sure.
in there.
Sure. I just going to mention that the environmental ethos of Indigenous communities is very strong, um, very strong. And sorry, there's somebody drilling behind me. I hope you guys can't hear that. But that environmental ethos is so strong with Indigenous people from around the world. And I mentioned our Okanagan language. The name to describe ourselves as a people is Insilk, and that literally translates as torn from the earth. So if Indigenous people, we see ourselves as the land, then you wonder why Indigenous people get upset when the land is being harmed. And there's protest. A lot of people may not even understand why Indigenous people are doing that. Some Indigenous may not have that history of their own people, but it's because the land is everything. And to put that in perspective, there's some Scottish Highlanders, old men and women, that can smell peat and tell you where it's from in Scotland. That's an intimate relationship with the land, right? That comes from centuries and centuries of being in a place. And that's what Indigenous people have in this country. And when we as a system can really understand that and work with that, I think that our whole system would start changing to have a much more environmental ethos. And personally, I think it would make us a lot better system overall. But thanks.
Mary, is there anything that you wanted to touch on the Indigenous worldview in education, or any other comments that you would like to make?
I think on the last question there about, how do you keep that relationship going, create that space? Number one is creating it, right? Carving it out. Whereas we do have a lot of school boards or areas, districts, schools, educators trying to create that space. And then of course we have others who are just starting or who are beginning. And John is very correct when he says about that relationship with the land being very intimate. Like when it's my spouse was laughing at me last fall, and I stopped and I went, "It's gonna rain," and I sniffed the air, and he's like, "Okay," and I'm like, "It is," I said, and plus my knee is hurting. It's the arthritis. But creating those spaces and participating in them, and also being that inclusive body there, where embracing the students, where there may be a mix of Cree, there may be a mix of Dene, there may be Soto, maybe the different dialects, but embracing all those cultures too, and having that relationship, or trying to create that relationship with the land, seeking out those spaces. And a lot of that is through creating relationships with local Indigenous people, communities, and groups and organizations. So it's not just singular and not focused on just Cree or just Dene or just Soto, but encompassing all of those Indigenous knowledge bases.
Thank you. I think, yeah, creating space is so important. And, they always say that we make time for the things that are important. And in the busy world that we all live in, we need to make time to create that space. John, I was just wondering if you have any kind of closing remarks or observations to share.
Yeah, I did have one more, Renee, and that's have fun. Like our people are very, very funny and humorous, and as a system, it's there's somewhat of a too formal situation where you're trying to build a relationship, and sometimes you got to get through that. And Mary and Colleen both mentioned earlier food, getting together for meals, meeting elders and aunties and uncles, get into the community and start having fun with our community members, right? And that's an important thing. And I don't know, you need to go there and not be afraid, and don't be afraid to step forward and say, "Yeah, I want to come and meet our community partners and have fun and build a relationship. The very important stuff. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you. And I think that helps to answer a question that we just got in the chat, and that's what are our thoughts on how to walk in two worlds to bring Indigenous communities and school districts together to start the conversation. And I know I live about 5 hours from my community, and I'm part of our Facebook group, and I see how many events we hold. We love a good event, whether it's, a powwow, a feast, ceremony. And I think John said we're funny, and there are those connections to be made if we're just not as nervous to do so through creating that space.
Yeah, for that, to answer that question as well, and walking in two worlds, it's just the current reality. And for a lot of Indigenous youth, it's you are your community, you're a reflection of your community, and that's where your identity comes from. And if you were to even think about it, a student might not even know what that means. Like, to walk in two worlds. I'm in my community. Is that one world and school's another? Right? When does it change into I'm going to school and I feel like I can see myself here as well? And that's important for all kids. And even we've got a lot of low socioeconomic children in every city and town across the country, and they're not just Indigenous or non-Indigenous. It's all kids are kids, and probably one of the biggest things there is ensuring that all children can have a great relationship with all of their peers and learn more about our history as a country. But I would really recommend that if school districts want to do that, it starts with a relationship with every constituent they have. Okay. Sharing food is key, Roger. Absolutely.
And Mary, you walk in two worlds every day, given, your not only your background, but also, you as the treaty commissioner. There are two signatories to those treaties. So I don't know if you have any insights on two worlds.
She said she wasn't going to nod anymore, remember?
Somewhat. Yeah. It's hard not to when there's such good panelists and the conversation is very relatable, right? In what we see and what we do. Walking with two worlds. I had commented to my spouse about, I said, I feel like it's another world every time I left the reserve. That's how I used to feel. And going to school off the reserve, getting on that bus took you somewhere else. And you had to act different. You had to behave differently. And then as you get older, of course, I went to law school, and I was the first member of my community to go to law school and to become a lawyer. And that was very different. I had to hang who I am in here outside that classroom door so I could learn that law. Those laws, very colonial in context, completely conflict with Indigenous epistemology and knowledge and ways of knowing, completely conflict. But in order to be a lawyer in that system, I need to know that system so I can navigate people through it. And then becoming a treaty commissioner years later, you very much sit in the middle. Your own people are on this side, trying to push and ensure that the spirit and intent of what our ancestors entered into is being honored. And then you have the crown on this side that's very contextual, where these are black and white words. The treaties are, but yet that's not the truth. That's not how it is, right? There's two sides. So how do we balance that to come to a common understanding where it's not litigious? Sometimes it's unable to happen and things do go to court, and we see that all the time. So it is a very fine line, and I can definitely say, as a professional, you sometimes want to lose your professionality. You want to hit the wall. You want to cry into your pillow when you get those racist phone calls or letters or whatever. And you feel like you're accountable to the people, and you are. So it is a very much a fine line to walk in those two worlds. And like I was saying, growing up, every time I left the reserve or got on the school bus to go to town school, I felt like it's a different world. Law school felt like a different world. I wish I could have went to First Nations University for my law degree, but they don't have that there. And a couple presidents ago, I had said that, we should talk about doing a law degree, an Indigenous law degree. It would be, I think more Indigenous people would want to enter into the profession of law if you have that preparation and understanding that you can't change it. That's their system. And we have to do our best to navigate our people through that system. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to give a big thank you to both John and Mary. And I don't know if it was connectivity, but we've lost Colleen, but big thank you to Colleen as well for taking part in this and sharing your perspectives and your experience and the wealth of knowledge that you do have. I mean, as always, this has been a learning experience for me. I enjoy listening to it. So I really hope that everyone else has enjoyed this and can take away and create action and create that space with Indigenous leaders in organizations and communities. Because at the end of the day, it's about the kids. Like John said, kids are kids, and we're really here to help support them and create success, whatever that might look like for everyone involved. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Nancy for doing the technical support on this. And I hope you guys all have a great day.
Thank you, Renee. Mary, so nice meeting you. Very nice to meet you, Mary.
Nice to meet you too as well, John. Thank you, everyone.
So are we staying on, Renee, or are we just saying goodbye?
I think we're just saying goodbye. I'm not sure. I don't know if we're still live on the broadcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator. You did a wonderful job.
Thanks, John. I'm sure we'll connect again.
Nancy's muted.
Thank you so much.
Okay. You guys have a great day and be safe.